Now bear with me for a second on this one, but I've got a working theory here that the recent performances of Klitschko against Pulev, Alexander Povetkin, Alex Leapai somehow reflect well on David Haye. Now my thoughts behind this is we're now in an era where Klitschko's dominance is such that despite their defeats, I would guess the vast majority would consider both Alexander Povetkin and Pulev as top 5 heavyweights. You'd have to say, out of your top 5 heavyweights, you're looking at Klitschko and then 4 of the following, really. Stavern, Wilder, Fury, Chisora, Povetkin, Pulev. Realistically, that's probably the top 7 or 8. We're at a stage where a fighter like Pulev can be destroyed, knocked down multiple times ahead of a 5th round stoppage, and still be considered a top heavyweight. This is because Klitschko's dominance in the division is such that a loss like that doesn't even reflect that badly on a contender, because Klitschko is so dominant. Now, I wanted to compare and contrast the performances of David Haye with Leapai, Pulev and Povetkin. Let's make a start. Those 3 fighters, Pulev, Povetkin and Leapai, in my opinion, never gave themselves a chance of beating Wladamir Klitschko. Tactically, they got it completely wrong. Pulev, his tactic was to out-jab Wladamir. He stood at 3/4 range in order to land his jab, because he is the smaller man. In order to feint with his jab, he kept moving his front 2 hands, exposing his chin. Pulev played a dangerous game. Because his main attribute is his jab, he fought at Wladamir's range, he neglected his movement, he neglected his defence. That was particularly relevant with Pulev, because he's not a fighter who's going to take you out with one punch necessarily. So in my opinion, Pulev lost that fight before it had even begun. I'm sorry if there's some interference in the background, there's a car alarm going on outside, but I'll persevere. Pulev lost that fight before it had begun. He never bought himself a realistic opportunity of beating Klitschko. Now Povetkin was another fighter. In theory, he had the right idea. Get inside on Wladamir. Land power punches, land your big hooks. This is the guy who sparked out Manuel Char and Carlos Takam with 1-punch knockouts. He's a big puncher. He can break you down on the inside. And that was his theory. Now hypothetically, that was a good idea. But in actual fact, he never had a realistic chance, because he didn't have a plan B. And when Wladamir Klitschko's holding game and ability to stop Klitschko's inside work was continually allowed by the ref, he had no other idea, no other game plan. Alex Leapai, Leapai seemed to have no clue. He fought like a barroom brawler. He was just swinging wildly, hitting and hoping. None of those 3, whilst you could analyse it on paper and say, oh, Povetkin could do this, Pulev could do this, on fight night, I don't believe any of those 3 bought an attack that allowed them to beat Wladamir Klitschko. All of them were also knocked down. Pulev was knocked down 4 times en route to a 5th round stoppage. Leapai was knocked down, I can't remember the exact figure, but multiple times en route to a 5th round stoppage. Povetkin was knocked down at least 3 or 4 rounds, went the distance, I think lost every round. Now David Haye did better in my opinion, for 2 reasons. The first reason is the obvious reason, that he went the distance without taking an absolute pasting. He didn't sustain the damage that Povetkin sustained. He didn't get knocked down like Leapai and Pulev did. So on an obvious level, he performed better. But in addition to that, he also, to an extent, brought the right tactics. Now I know people will say David Haye didn't come to fight, he didn't engage. And that's fair enough. But let's be honest, David Haye was never going to out-jab Klitschko. He's a much smaller man. David Haye's inside game was never so electric, that he was going to be able to get on the inside, avoid Klitschko's clinches and start smashing up the champ's ribs. That was never going to happen. David Haye had no hope of out-jabbing Klitschko. David Haye had no hope of destroying Klitschko on the inside. Now let's think, where does David Haye have a chance of winning this fight? And in my idea, it's twofold. Superior movement. I know Klitschko is an exceptional athlete, an Olympic gold medalist no less. But if there's one fighter who can claim being more athletic than Klitschko in the heavyweight division, it's possibly David Haye. David Haye used his movement and his athleticism. He didn't stand in front of Klitschko like Pulev did, or like Alex Leapai did. He presented him with a moving target. He put Klitschko in awkward positions. Then David Haye relied on his power. With a puncher like David Haye, and I'll say the same thing if Deontay Wilder ever goes on to fight Wladamir Klitschko, there is always a chance of winning the fight. Now I say, to my eye, Pulev didn't have any realistic chance of winning this fight on the weekend. I think Pulev is probably a better fighter than Deontay Wilder. But in my opinion, Deontay Wilder has a bigger chance of beating Klitschko than Pulev does. And that's because, even though I think Pulev is the superior fighter, Deontay Wilder brings the kind of power that can change a game and change a fight at any second. David Haye, I would class in a similar league of punching power. Look at what he did to Derek Chisora. Over 12 rounds, Tyson Fury, Robert Helenius, Vitaly Klitschko couldn't do that. I was at that fight. Haye's power was devastating. And David Haye, especially if we suspect that Klitschko may not have a 10 out of 10 chin, David Haye is always a live outsider in a fight with Wladamir Klitschko. Now I appreciate David Haye used movement and used range for the majority of the fight, but he at least gave himself opportunities to land on Klitschko. On multiple occasions he was able to land his trademark haymaker. Now it didn't have the desired effect in this fight, but every time David Haye threw that punch, he was buying himself a lottery ticket. He had a realistic opportunity of ending the fight there and then, because the power he carries is an absolute game changer. Now what do you expect David Haye to do? Do you expect him to stand in front of Klitschko like Pulev did and get his head taken off with the jab? Do you expect him to fight inside, or try to fight inside like Povetkin did, and to be clinched and mauled? What you'd expect David Haye to do is stay out of the range of the jab and use his athleticism to rush in and ambush and throw that big right hand, try and land the haymaker. To my eye, that's what he did. Now I know it was a one-sided fight, and I know David Haye lost fair and square, but he at least had moments in the fight. I'd go as far to say he took a round off Wladamir Klitschko. Now Klitschko hasn't lost a round against Leapai, against Pulev, against Povetkin. He won every single round. So the fact that David Haye not only lasted the distance, not only didn't get knocked down, but also had spells in the fight, and also took the odd round of Klitschko, should be to his credit. I know there was the huge excuse about his broken toe afterwards, which seemed pitiful. But conceivably, if the guy did have a broken toe, he could have put in a slightly improved performance. Now, I'm not saying that David Haye did have a broken toe. I'm not saying he would have beaten Klitschko. But let's at least consider the possibility he could have been a percentage or two better if in peak physical condition. So I think that performance deserves more credit than it gets, because David Haye is often mocked for that performance. But to go 12 rounds with Klitschko, not to get knocked down and to have spells in a fight, must be considered quite an achievement if we consider the level of dominance that Wladamir Klitschko is now hitting, where he's destroying opponents who, even after being KO'd early, are still considered top 5 heavyweights. David Haye got a lot right that fight. His movement, his foot movement, his head movement and his range made sure that Vladimir's jab wasn't quite as effective as it has been against more recent opponents. His speed and agility meant he was able to land his one punch, his haymaker. And as I say, even though he didn't engage for every minute in every fight, every time he threw that punch, there was scope for the fight to end there and then. I don't think tactically David Haye got a lot wrong. If he was to take the fight again, I'd recommend he uses movement. I'd recommend he doesn't stand in front of Klitschko. I'd recommend he tries to win the fight by knockout rather than trying to outpoint Klitschko. I'd perhaps suggest slightly more activity, but I think it was tactically a better performance than we saw from the Povetkin Leapai and Pulev, because I think neither of those guys had a chance of winning. I also think defensively, with his head movement and his foot movement and his distancing, it was a better performance than those three. And offensively, how many of those three were able to land the same sort of shots that David Haye were able to land? Not regularly, but over the course of the fight it did happen. So I review that David Haye fight and rank it a lot higher. If we compare it to Povetkin and Pulev, 2 top 5 heavyweights, I would say tactically, offensively and defensively, Haye puts in the best performance of the lot. Food for thought, potentially with his comeback in 2015. I'm interested to hear people's thoughts on this. Am I barking up the wrong tree? Or do you think David Haye deserves slightly less mocking and slightly more credit for this performance, having seen the recent Pulev fight? Please comment below, follow me on Twitter @BoxingGossip.